This is Thomas Edison. You may know him from this, and this is Louis Armstrong. You may know him from this. In their own ways, they both revolutionized music, from Frank Sinatra to Queen. Let's explore the story and answer the question: how was music recorded in the 1920s?
Before the widespread use of electronic recording devices, everything was acoustic or mechanical. The process relied entirely on the physical movement of sound waves propagating throughout the air. And without the aid of electricity, microphones, or amplifiers, this was way more difficult than you might think. And it all started with the father of electricity, Thomas Edison himself. In 1877, Thomas Edison was known for having patented improvements on the telegraph. He was operating a successful business that manufactured devices such as his machine that could record telegraph transmissions so they could be decoded later. This version of a recording device didn't actually record the sound that can be played back later, but instead physical engravings and etches into paper that could then be deciphered. But this got Thomas Edison thinking, was there actually a way that you could record sound and play it back later exactly how you heard it? The key to Edison's first recording device had to do with understanding that how we produce sound and how we interpret and hear sound are really one and the same. Any sound is just a vibration propagating throughout the air, eventually going into your ear canal and vibrating a thinly stretched diaphragm called your eardrum, and those vibrations are then interpreted by your brain to understand what you're hearing. So, Edison understood that sound waves were doing half of the work for him. He just needed to harness that vibration and have a way of replicating that same vibration back. So what he did was he attached a thinly stretched diaphragm to an engraving needle. This engraving needle would go along a moving piece of paper, etching the vibrations of whatever sound was going into it into the paper. However, this paper medium was very flimsy and not very sturdy and could easily be ripped. It was just very fragile. He then experimented with a brass cylinder with tinfoil wrapped around it and a part of a telegraph called the repeater, basically a microphone, being used to funnel the sound of a human voice down to the engraving needle, engraving the sound into the foil. So to finally test his idea, he yelled "Mary Had a Little Lamb" into the device and cranked it and heard "Mary Had a Little Lamb" back. But specifically for music, people could have bands in their own homes. Eventually, by the 1920s, this technology had advanced enough to have a little bit more reliant materials like wax cylinders or shellac discs that the phonographs or gramophones would etch into. And this was the birth of recorded music and the first time recording engineers ever became a thing, and it was a lot different back then than it is now. First, using just the acoustic energy from the performers had very strict limitations. The horn that all of the audio would be funneled into towards the diaphragm very much limited the frequencies that could be represented, roughly between 250 and 2500 hertz. This led to a very tinny and boxy sound that you could associate with recordings from that time. Dynamic range was also a big issue. If things were too loud, it could easily distort, and soft sounds could easily get lost in the noise floor. This recording technique also very much dictated what instruments were most prevalent in bands. Instruments that projected strongly, like brass and woodwinds and drums, were very popular in recordings. And understand, when this was being recorded, everything was completely committed. There was no mixing process after. There was nothing you could really do. Once it was recorded, it was done. So mixing was done beforehand, in the room, physically moving some louder instruments further away and maybe bringing the vocalist to the front right in front of the horn. They got the mix and the sound that they wanted before they even hit record. Some singers even used specially shaped megaphones to project their voice over the sound of the orchestra or whatever band was supporting them. So the studio of the 1920s was very different. There weren't any big mixing boards, no patch bays, no preamps, no way to edit, cut, mix, or even overdub. This meant precision and stamina from everyone involved, and mostly smaller groups, as the one horn couldn't really fill the sound of an entire orchestra, and even if it could, it would sound incredibly busy on the limited range of frequencies that they had available. The Victor Talking Machine Company, Edison Records, and Columbia Records were the dominant companies using this technology in the early 1920s. They operated their own studios in major cities like New York City, New Jersey, and London. They produced thousands of recordings each year, and despite the physical limitations of this acoustic recording method, it was a huge commercial success. Acoustic recording kind of defined the sound of early jazz, ragtime, and vaudeville-era music. However, musicians and listeners alike were very eager to hear what improvements would be made to recording and listening of music, and in just a couple years, they certainly would not be disappointed. During the mid-1920s, recording went through a big technological change, all thanks to the introduction of electrical recording. This innovation replaced the purely mechanical and acoustic way of recording with amplified microphones, vacuum tube amplifiers, and electromechanical cutting heads. The key breakthrough came from Western Electric, the engineering branch of AT&T. They developed and patented an entirely new system to convert electrical signals into physical grooves on a disc. In 1925, the Victor Talking Machine Company and Columbia Records became the first companies to embrace this technology, starting their introduction into the electrical recording era. In an electrical recording studio, the big horn would be replaced by a microphone, commonly a condenser or a carbon-style microphone. Instead of relying on the physical airwaves to move the stylus and record, the microphone would pick up those differences in pressure and record it to an electrical signal. These signals were then amplified by vacuum tube amplifiers and sent to an electromagnetic cutting head that would then cut the grooves onto a disc. This disc would be the wax master disc, and this could capture way more frequencies than just the purely acoustic method, from roughly 50 Hz to 6000 Hz. For the first time, the listeners could hear the subtlety in a performer's vocal inflection, or the resonance of a piano, or the shimmer of the drum cymbals. The new technology also greatly improved how the musicians were in the recording studio and what they were able to do. Instead of crowding around a horn, now musicians were able to comfortably be in their spots, knowing that the microphone will pick them up. But that's an important thing, the microphone. Typically in this era, things weren't really close mic'd, like in a current studio where you might have up to 8 different microphones on a single drum kit. This was still very much recorded with a microphone in the front of the room and the band around it, recording with one take, no overdubs. This was still single track recording. They only had one track. They didn't know anything else. There wasn't anything else that anyone had ever thought of. For these record companies, the shift to electrical recording processes required a big investment, but it did very quickly pay off. And the difference in sound quality was very, very evident. It wasn't just a fad. In fact, on the covers of these records, it would often be written orthophonic or new process to show the superiority of these new recordings. Victor even introduced the orthophonic Victrola, a redesigned phonograph designed specifically for the new electrical recording process discs, and it became a major success. Culturally, this new recording process widely broadened what could be preserved and shared, and by the late 1920s, this new electric recording technique became the industry standard, not only improving the fidelity of music recording, but improving the culture of music itself. As the recording technology of the 1920s improved, so did how the music was consumed by consumers. The primary medium of playing back music and listening to records was a phonograph. By the 1920s, these were a widespread household item. Records for sale were made from shellac, a brittle material derived from natural resin, and all the discs of this time were standardized to 78 RPM, or rotations per minute. Each disc typically held about 3 minutes per each side, this limitation of which shaped how music is made today, if you've ever wondered why music is always around that 3.5-minute mark. The phonograph became a symbol of modern life and domestic leisure, and by the mid-1920s, manufacturing had made it so it became way more affordable to lower and middle class. Record companies began selling phonographs and records as combo sets, and eventually, as mentioned, the Victor's orthophonic Victrola, introduced in 1925, was specifically designed to capture the electronic recording process and reproduce a fuller, more rich sound with more subtlety. It featured an exponential horn concealed in a cabinet for a more fuller tone and volume. For the consumer, this Victrola was a commercial triumph, aligning perfectly with the idea of progress in the music recording industry. Records were distributed widely among department stores, specialized record shops, and catalogs. Urban centers often offered listening rooms where people could listen to phonographs or records before buying, while rural households more relied on catalog mail-in sales. This widened the band of who could listen to music and who can enjoy it from across economic standards. There became a new consumer idea that companies very much took note of, the idea of owning music, having a record from your favorite artist. This became a new draw that companies were very much taking in mind. The kind of records that became commercially available became more and more diverse. Record companies not only produced the popular dance songs, but also classical selections or specific collections to specific catalogs. The 1920s saw the emergence of race records, which were records specifically tailored towards African Americans with jazz tradition, blues, and African American artists. Then there was the hillbilly selection, which showed southern folk and early country style music. Stores and companies really relied on these marketing categories, and they very much reflect the racial and social norms of the time. Though with these race records became a big shift in how much African American culture was being popularized in American pop culture. And though the phonograph was undoubtedly the dominant medium in which people consumed music, the radio was increasingly challenging that domain. And unlike a phonograph, new entertainment and new recordings, new music became free once a family purchased a receiver. Music, entertainment, sports, news could all be broadcasted simultaneously to multiple homes across the US. Yet rather than radio replacing records, they actually reinforced one another. To fill airtime, radio broadcasts played records to fill that time. And typically hearing a song on the radio meant more drive for people to buy that record. By the 1920s, the phonograph industry reached new unprecedented heights. In 1927 alone, Americans purchased over 100 million records. This being a testament to how music had become now a part of an American everyday life. And record companies now had rosters of artists and cultivating stars, kind of making a pop culture, and this kind of industry boom being so associated with the roaring 20s. But this proved to be quite a fragile state. The stock market crash of 1929 and soon the onset of the Great Depression would devastate sales of record labels, reducing production to a fraction of its past volume. However, still the cultural habit of collecting records and loving artists definitely did shape for decades to come and did not go away in this time period. Shifting away from phonographs and records, let's talk about radio broadcasting of the 1920s. This decade marked the birth of mass media, and radio was certainly at the forefront of that. The first commercial radio station, KDKA in Pittsburgh, began regular broadcasting in 1920, famously airing the results of the presidential election that year. And within only a few years of that start came hundreds of stations across the US, from large cities to small towns. By the end of the decade, more than 10 million Americans own a receiver in their household, and music, once local, became a national phenomenon. Radio technology developed rapidly after World War I, building on those wartime innovations in wireless communications technology. When talking about any kind of technology that had significant innovations in the 20th century, you gotta talk about one of the world wars. The introduction of vacuum tube amplifiers made it possible to transmit clearer and stronger signals over larger distances, and better receivers made it better to receive it more reliably. Early radios were expensive, and outside of military use, they were commonly sold as kits for hobbyists. But companies like RCA mass-marketed complete home radio sets, typically installed in some elegant wooden furniture to blend with the rest of the household. And music played a huge role in attracting audiences. Radio stations filled their schedules with vocalists, orchestras, and dance bands. And unlike the phonograph records, radio could actually broadcast live events. So typically, radio broadcasters would go into live orchestra or dance halls and record live music. This brought music into the home as an event. Families would gather around their radios at a given hour to experience a live event, everyone all together simultaneously around America. Programs like the Ever Ready Hour and NBC's orchestral performances demonstrated how radio can combine entertainment and artistry for mass audiences. Radio also greatly changed how the economics of music worked. Labels initially feared how free play on radio broadcasts would hurt record sales, but actually the inverse happened. The play of a new artist or a new record on the radio would drive sales for that record. Advertisers quickly realized radio's potential, and sponsorships became the natural funding model. Music programming became entwined with consumer culture. Songs were now also vehicles for marketing strategies. Music broadcast on radio also being a vehicle for products and lifestyles. But perhaps more importantly, radio also broke down geographic and cultural barriers. Genres such as jazz, blues, country, and even Hawaiian music reached people it never would have before. This national exposure fostered this sense of cultural exchange and identity. Even if in policy and widely in culture, these racial segregations were still in place. However, the sound of America itself, a cultural mixing pot full of diversity, was broadcast to homes nightly. The 1920s, where everything started. However, it's more than just the beginning of recorded music. It's a moment where music became a medium of memory, identity, and imagination. The decade's legacy still shares an echo every time a song is listened to, streamed, or shared. Each one a continuation of the revolution that began the first time a voice was shared over the grooves of a shellac disc.